Money used to mean something real. A gold coin contained gold. A silver dollar represented actual silver. And paper currency, when it first appeared, was literally a receipt, a promise that you could exchange it for metal held in a vault somewhere. The value of money was physical, tangible, measurable. But something changed over the past century, something so fundamental that it rewrote the rules of economics and power. Central banks discovered that money doesn't need to represent anything real, it just needs to be believed. They learned that confidence itself could be manufactured, that expectations could be managed, and that the entire global economy could run on nothing more than carefully crafted words and the collective faith that those words would be honored. This wasn't a conspiracy or a coup, it was an evolution driven by crisis after crisis, each one teaching central bankers that their real job wasn't controlling the money supply or managing gold reserves. Their job was printing confidence, manufacturing the belief that the system would hold together one more day, one more year, indefinitely. And the terrifying truth is that it works, right up until the moment it doesn't. The story begins with the gold standard, the system that dominated global finance for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Under the gold standard, currencies were defined as specific weights of gold. A British pound was 113 grains of pure gold. An American dollar was 23.22 grains. And because both were tied to gold, exchange rates between them were fixed and predictable. More importantly, the gold standard imposed discipline. Governments couldn't simply print unlimited money because paper currency had to be backed by gold reserves. If a country printed more notes than it had gold to redeem them, people would demand gold in exchange and the reserves would drain away. This constraint was supposed to keep governments honest, prevent inflation, and ensure monetary stability. But the gold standard had a fatal flaw that only became obvious during crises. It was rigid. When economies needed flexibility, when banks needed emergency liquidity, when unemployment soared and businesses failed, the gold standard prevented central banks from responding. They couldn't simply create money to ease credit crunches because they were limited by gold reserves. This rigidity turned financial panics into catastrophes and recessions into depressions. The Great Depression was the gold standard's final exam, and it failed spectacularly. Countries that stayed on gold longest suffered deepest and longest. Countries that abandoned gold early, like Britain in 1931 and the United States in 1933, recovered faster because they could expand money supplies and reduce interest rates without worrying about gold reserves draining away. The lesson was clear but politically impossible to accept. The gold standard, revered as the foundation of sound money and financial discipline, was actually killing economies. When President Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933, one of his first acts was to ban private gold ownership and devalue the dollar against gold by 41%. It was presented as an emergency measure to fight the Depression, but it was really something more profound. It was the beginning of central banks learning that their power came not from the gold they held, but from the confidence they could project. Roosevelt's banking holiday and fireside chats weren't primarily about policy mechanics. They were about restoring confidence, convincing Americans that banks were safe, that money would hold value, and that the system wouldn't collapse. And it worked, not because of the gold backing the currency, but because people believed it would work. World War II accelerated this transformation. Every major combatant abandoned meaningful gold convertibility to finance military spending. They printed money in quantities that bore no relationship to gold reserves, and inflation was controlled not through monetary discipline, but through rationing, price controls, and war bonds that soaked up excess currency. When the war ended, the world faced a choice: return to the rigid gold standard that had contributed to the Depression, or create something new. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 chose a middle path. The US dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, and other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. But unlike the classical gold standard, the system included escape valves, the IMF to provide emergency loans, capital controls to prevent destabilizing flows, and adjustable exchange rates that could be changed if necessary. The Bretton Woods system worked reasonably well for about 25 years, but it carried the same contradiction as every gold-based system. The United States had to maintain enough gold reserves to back dollar convertibility, but it also had to supply enough dollars to facilitate global trade and serve as the world's reserve currency. This was called the Triffin dilemma, and it was unsolvable. By the late 1960s, American gold reserves were draining away as other countries, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, demanded gold in exchange for the dollars they'd accumulated. The US was financing the Vietnam War and Great Society programs through deficit spending, creating more dollars than it had gold to back. Something had to break. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would temporarily suspend dollar convertibility to gold. He called it the Nixon Shock, and temporary lasted forever. The gold window never reopened. Within 2 years, every major currency was floating freely against every other, backed by nothing except government decree and economic power. For the first time in history, the entire global monetary system ran on pure fiat currency, money that had value only because governments said it did and people believed them. This should have been catastrophic. Without gold backing, what prevented governments from printing unlimited currency and destroying its value through inflation? The answer central banks discovered was confidence. The 1970s taught a brutal lesson about what happens when confidence erodes. Inflation surged to double digits in the United States, Britain, and many other countries. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 made things worse, but the underlying problem was monetary. Central banks had learned they could print money without gold constraints, but they hadn't yet learned how to print confidence, how to convince the public and markets that they would use their power responsibly. Inflation expectations became unanchored. Workers demanded wage increases to keep up with rising prices. Businesses raised prices expecting costs to rise. And central banks accommodated this through money creation, validating expectations, and making inflation self-fulfilling. It was a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to break without catastrophic recession. Paul Volcker, appointed Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979, broke inflation through brute force. He raised interest rates to levels not seen before or since, deliberately inducing a severe recession to crush inflation expectations. The prime rate hit 21.5%. Unemployment exceeded 10%. Businesses failed. Families lost homes. But inflation was broken, falling from over 13% to around 3% within 3 years. Volcker's victory wasn't primarily about monetary policy mechanics, it was about credibility. He proved that the Federal Reserve would do whatever necessary to control inflation, even if it meant enormous short-term pain. That credibility, once established, became the foundation of modern central banking. Markets began to believe that central banks meant what they said, that inflation targets would be defended, and that monetary policy would be used to maintain stability. Confidence had been printed through suffering. The 1980s and 1990s saw central banks refine this lesson into a science. They discovered that managing expectations was more powerful than managing money supply. If people believed inflation would remain low, they'd behave accordingly. Workers wouldn't demand excessive wage increases, businesses wouldn't raise prices aggressively. And that behavior would make low inflation self-fulfilling. The key was credibility, convincing markets that the central bank had both the tools and the will to hit its targets. Central banks became more transparent, publishing forecasts, explaining decisions, and communicating constantly with markets. The old model of mysterious central bankers operating in secret was replaced by media-savvy officials who understood that words were as important as actions. Alan Greenspan, Volcker's successor, became the master of this new art. His congressional testimonies and speeches moved markets despite being famously opaque. Greenspan spoke in convoluted sentences designed to say little while seeming to say much, allowing markets to interpret his words however they wanted. If markets believed Greenspan would support them, stock prices rose. If they feared he'd raise rates, they'd sell. The actual policies mattered less than the perception of what Greenspan might do. He was printing confidence through carefully managed ambiguity, letting markets believe whatever kept them stable. The 2008 financial crisis taught central banks their most important lesson yet. When the system faces existential threat, confidence is the only thing that matters, and creating that confidence requires unlimited commitment. As banks failed and credit markets froze, the Federal Reserve under Ben Bernanke unleashed tools that previous generations of central bankers would have considered unthinkable. Quantitative easing meant creating trillions of dollars to buy assets, not temporarily but on a scale and duration that dwarfed anything done before. Zero interest rates, forward guidance promising rates would stay low for years, alphabet soup lending facilities to every corner of the financial system, all of it designed to project one message: the Fed will do whatever it takes, and there is no limit to our power. The phrase "whatever it takes" became the mantra of modern central banking. Mario Draghi, European Central Bank President, uttered those 3 words in July 2012 as the Eurozone debt crisis threatened to destroy the currency union. Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. He didn't announce specific policies. He didn't commit to particular actions. He just stated unlimited commitment, and markets believed him. The crisis abated not because the ECB did anything immediately, but because Draghi had successfully printed confidence. Investors believed the ECB would prevent collapse, so they stopped betting on collapse, which prevented collapse. It was circular logic that worked because belief made it real. This is the fundamental insight of modern central banking. Reality doesn't constrain monetary policy. Belief does. A central bank with credibility can create money in unlimited quantities without triggering inflation, as long as people believe that inflation will remain controlled. It can hold interest rates at zero or even negative, defying centuries of economic theory, as long as markets believe it's appropriate policy. And it can purchase assets in quantities that dwarf its balance sheet, creating money from nothing to do so, as long as the public has confidence that the central bank knows what it's doing. The COVID-19 pandemic proved this beyond any doubt. Within weeks of lockdowns beginning in March 2020, central banks around the world committed trillions. The Federal Reserve announced unlimited quantitative easing, removing any cap on asset purchases. It would buy as much as necessary, for as long as necessary, whatever it took. Other central banks followed. Bank of Japan, Bank of England, European Central Bank all committed to unlimited support. The money supply expanded at rates that would have caused hyperinflation under previous economic understanding. In the United States, M2 money supply increased by over 40% between February 2020 and February 2021, growth unprecedented in peacetime. Yet inflation remained controlled for over a year. Not because the money creation didn't happen, it absolutely did, but because confidence held. People believed central banks when they said inflation would be temporary, that the money creation was emergency response to a unique crisis, and that it would be unwound when conditions normalized. That belief shaped behavior. Businesses didn't raise prices aggressively. Workers didn't demand massive wage increases. And for a while, the belief held inflation in check despite monetary expansion that should have triggered price spirals. When inflation did surge in 2021 and 2022, it revealed the limitation of confidence-based central banking. You can print money indefinitely as long as confidence holds, but once inflation expectations become unanchored, once people stop believing central bank promises, the spiral can be difficult to stop without significant pain. The Federal Reserve's response was revealing. It couldn't directly control inflation through money supply, because modern money is largely created by private bank lending, not central bank printing. Instead, it tried to re-anchor expectations through aggressive communication, promising to raise interest rates until inflation was defeated. The Fed was printing confidence in its inflation-fighting credibility, trying to convince markets that it would cause a recession if necessary to restore price stability. This is what modern central banking has become. Not the management of gold reserves or even money supply in any traditional sense, but the management of expectations and beliefs. Central bankers are confidence artists in the literal sense, creating confidence through performance, communication, and occasionally action that validates their words. The tools are communication strategies, forward guidance promising policy paths years into the future, quantitative easing that creates money to purchase assets, and the ultimate trump card, the promise of unlimited intervention if crisis threatens. But this system rests on a foundation of collective belief that could shatter if tested too far. What happens when central banks promise inflation control but can't deliver? What happens when they commit to unlimited support but face political constraints? What happens when the public realizes that money has no backing except the central bank's word, and that word has been broken? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're being tested in real time as inflation persists, as government debts grow unsustainable, and as political pressure mounts on central banks to abandon independence and serve fiscal policy. The lesson from history is that confidence-based systems work until they don't, and the transition from working to failing happens faster than anyone expects. The assignats in revolutionary France were backed by confidence in confiscated church lands until they weren't. The Weimar Mark was backed by confidence in the German government until it wasn't. The gold standard itself was backed by confidence that convertibility would be maintained until it wasn't. Every monetary system ultimately rests on confidence, and when confidence breaks, the collapse is rapid and devastating. Modern central banks have learned to print confidence with sophisticated tools and constant communication. They've convinced markets and the public that money can be created in unlimited quantities without consequences as long as expectations remain anchored. And for decades, this has worked, allowing unprecedented monetary expansion, near-zero interest rates, and asset purchases that dwarf anything previously attempted. But confidence isn't infinite. It's accumulated slowly through credibility and consistency, and it can be destroyed quickly through policy mistakes or circumstances beyond central bank control. The fundamental question is whether central banks have actually solved the problems of monetary management or just pushed them into the future. Have they learned to sustainably print confidence, or have they simply borrowed confidence from the future to be repaid when the next crisis overwhelms their tools? The answer will determine whether the current system represents a genuine evolution in monetary science or just another chapter in the long history of confidence-based systems that eventually collapse under their own contradictions. What's certain is that modern money is belief. The dollars, euros, yen, and pounds circulating globally are backed by nothing except the confidence that central banks know what they're doing and that governments will honor their obligations. This makes the system flexible and responsive in ways the gold standard never was. But it also makes it fragile in ways that aren't obvious until confidence cracks. Because once people stop believing that the money in their wallets will hold value, once they lose faith that central banks can control inflation or prevent crisis, the entire structure can unravel with terrifying speed. Central banks learned to print confidence, and that discovery transformed the global economy, allowing growth and stability that would have been impossible under commodity-backed money. But they also created a system where the most important asset isn't gold, oil, or any physical resource. It's the public's continued belief that the system works. And belief, unlike gold, can vanish overnight when tested too hard or betrayed too often. The next crisis will test whether confidence can be printed indefinitely or whether there are limits that central banks are about to discover the hard way. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but confidence always breaks. And the question isn't whether it will happen, but whether you'll recognize the moment before everyone else does.